Ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats. The next session is about to begin.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the moderator of the session, Ben Makuch.
Hello, I am Ben Makuch. I am from Vice News. I'm a national security reporter, and we're going to be talking about, well, let me take you back quickly. Obviously, there's been a war in Ukraine since 2014, and there's been both a kinetic war and also a cyber war. We're going to be looking at how that's affected things in the latest iteration, and also specifically how NATO countries and European countries have reacted with offensive cyber capabilities. So with that, I'd like to introduce everyone who's on the panel today. Jarmo Sareva, Melissa Hathaway, Anett Numa, and Andrew Lee. So just to start things off, how has the latest iteration of this war, how has it unfolded from a cyber warfare, cyber capabilities perspective? Anyone can go ahead, Anett.
Yeah, so first of all, very happy to be here in Bratislava again, my third time in Globsec already. But speaking about the cyber scene as well, when you think about the war in Ukraine at the moment, what we see mostly in the media is that they're just covering what's happening in the fields, or just like the military part, but not so much attention on the cyber war. What I'm saying is that this is totally wrong information, that there is nothing happening in cyberspace in Ukraine at the moment. I mean, there has been a war in cyberspace between Ukraine and Russia already since 2014. And I think just like Ukraine is a very great example showing us that if you do repair and invest into education, to the exercises and so on, then you can resist these attacks. And this is why maybe we haven't seen that much happening right now. I mean, especially like just covered by the media side. But of course, it has drastically changed the entire aspect how we kind of like take the I would say the cyber diplomacy part as well. How do we respond to the attacks as well? Because the conversation we had before the war was totally something else that we're seeing today. And of course, we can get more into the details as this as well, what the future holds, because I would say operations really have changed, and so we have to do the same as well.
I should mention too, on the media point, if there's anybody here who's in government and wants to tell me something as a member of the media, I'm here to listen. Jarmo, you were talking to me backstage about this, but why haven't we heard enough about this, and how does it factor in?
There's two basic explanations. One is that Russian capabilities are not what one expected, and the other one is that Ukraine has been able to persist much better with the help of its friends and allies from both governments and the private sector, much better than expected. I would very much agree that Ukraine was more resilient, and it's been a result of long-term planning. And I would agree that there's much more than meets the eye going on in cyber.
It's funny you say that. Russia, their capabilities aren't as good as we thought they were. I mean, do you think there's a reason for that? Is it they're just quiet right now for going after Western countries and European nations?
I wasn't necessarily implying that their capabilities would be worse, because I said there's two explanations. Either they're worse than one expected. This would actually be much in line with their performance in the kinetic front, or that Ukraine has been more resilient. It's probably a combination of both. Whether we will see and hear and feel more in the weeks and months to come, that remains to be seen. at the beginning of the war, and especially as it became more and more clear that Finland and Sweden might well seek NATO membership, there was a sense of foreboding in Finland that something might come our way. There were and there are concerns about critical infrastructure, as there are in all Western open societies. So far, we haven't seen anything really substantial.
And Melissa, on that point, I mean, why haven't we seen anything substantial yet?
I think we have. We just haven't connected the dots. And I think it's really important to understand what there's been a lot of pre-positioning of access and weapons in our critical infrastructures around the world. And I know Andrew's been doing a lot of that analysis at ESET. But if you take it all the way back to, you can certainly go back to 2014, and the West has been investing significantly in helping build out the resilience of Ukraine, especially in its energy grid. But if you start to look at what happened in 2017 with NotPetya, which was one of the more significant wiper viruses that we had, I think it was a systematic testing of what a NATO response would look like. So if you're targeting what then was an accounting company that was responsible for payroll, among other things, taxes for Ukraine, it had a lot of secondary damage to it, and it took out almost all the logistics. Maersk Shipping, FedEx in Eastern Europe, UPS, et cetera, and it showed that you could actually delay NATO logistics by a minimum of 6 weeks and probably up to 4 to 6 months. That's pretty significant. We saw a similar wiper virus just actually executed at the very beginning of the war against Viasat. And that took down the communications in Ukraine, but it had an ancillary damage and took down the alternative energy, or the windmills and the wind generation in Germany and in Denmark. And so if I can take down an alternative energy source, I might make you a little bit more dependent on Russian oil and gas. And from my perspective, we're seeing distributed denial of service attacks and wiper viruses against Ukraine. We're seeing systematic targeting of telecom, alternative energy, agriculture, and of course, oil and gas and energy generation. I could go on, but I'll stop there.
Andrew, tell me, what is your analysis of this been so far?
Yeah, I think it's really sort of comes back to what Anett said right at the beginning, and Melissa has also alluded to. It's that Ukraine has been in a cyber conflict, or has been bearing the brunt of cyber conflict since 2013. And that gives you certain opportunities to prepare and to become more resilient. But when you're talking on a nation-state scale, to actually build a cyber capability on that scale and ensure that you have no points of vulnerability is nearly impossible. So we have seen these kind of ongoing attacks and testing of the defenses of Ukraine. And sort of to answer the point about Russia's capabilities that was alluded to, an attacker only needs to be as good as the problem, right? So they only need to be stronger than your defense. And so it depends where you want to attack. So I think one of the things that we've seen in our research is at ESET is that the Russians have, and other adversaries have deployed a range of capabilities, from the quite simple, some over-the-counter tools that have been perhaps Trojanized, right up to the far more complex and the far more advanced technologies in terms of malware capabilities. And one of the very important points is, and I think that's already alluded to this, is that these are not necessarily deployed at the time that they're used. So in many cases, the deployment of the malware it can be months in advance, and the preparation is months in advance. For instance, Hermetic Wiper, which we saw deployed on the 23rd of February, the day before or the evening before the Russian invasion of Ukraine, we actually, when we analyzed that, we saw that the original versions of that had been compiled in October, December. The signing certificate for that had been purchased in April 2021. So there's clearly long planning. There's clearly long tails to the operations, and the capabilities are there. That said, I don't think it's gone away. We've seen the resurgence of the Indestroyer. where the one thing that I think the Russians have shown is, and it's true of KSAT, they do not care about collateral damage. And I think just to bring it back to the sort of the real realm, cyber attacks can, will, and do kill people. Mm-hmm. If you can black out in the middle of winter hundreds of thousands of people's homes, they'll freeze. Mm-hmm. They won't be able to, they won't be able to survive. If you can disrupt a hospital, people will die because they're being transported to another hospital.
And Russia's done it before too.
Yes.
I mean, in 2015, there was I think it was December 2015, there was the attack on the power station in Ivano-Frankivsk that turned off the lights.
There were two. There was one in 2015, and the blackout, and then a second one in
2016.
In 2016.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And I remember one of the features of the first one, at least, that I always was struck by was they DDoSed the emergency response systems. So when people called in to see what was going on, they couldn't even reach anybody. And it was sort of a very simple attack. I remember talking to people in the Pentagon, and they said, this wasn't Stuxnet. This was something that was repurposed and very simple and deployed really smartly. So are we seeing those types of attacks again? Like, is it less sort of the Gucci stuff and more the simple things?
It's a combination, as I said. Hermetic Wiper itself was not a particularly complex piece of malware. It wasn't high effort, but it was effective enough to wipe hundreds of systems. That said, there are other pieces of software that we've seen, other pieces of malicious software. There are groups who operate throughout in the Russian-speaking world, not only them, but in also other parts of the world, who do build much more sophisticated tools. Some of the tools used in Indestroyer displayed an extremely good knowledge of SCADA systems, of power control systems. So it's really a range of capabilities, and it comes back to what are you trying to achieve? What's your objective? If you can disrupt very cheaply with very simple tools, why not? If you want to do something a bit more, guaranteed to be a bit more destructive, then maybe more effort is needed.
I know that in the actual training of soldiers has happened on the NATO level, that they've trained tons of people or tons of Ukrainian soldiers in the West, and that's been a major part of why Ukraine has responded so well to this iteration of the invasion. Has the same thing happened, prior to that in the cyber realm?
Yeah, definitely. But I would change it this other way around, so that we're going to see Ukrainians soon training us. I'm not joking. They're getting the best experience right now. So in Estonia, we have the NATO cybersecurity headquarters, so the CCDCOE is based in Estonia. And we just recently, back in March, in 2 days, we got all the NATO countries to accept Ukraine as a member of our center. And right now, we're expecting a technical expert to come to the center and to provide their knowledge as well. So I'm saying we've been helping Ukrainians to get where they are today. But the experience and what they're facing today is going to bring them to us in a way, so that they can also teach what they have been learning from the current cyber war as well. So they're going to be very valuable. And soon we want everybody would want that Ukrainians would be sitting here with us on a table when it comes to discussing about cybersecurity.
They're battle-hardened, so to speak.
Yes, I mean
I have to agree.
Many more ways than one.
I have to agree. I mean, one of the very interesting things is that since 2013, the capability of the Ukrainian CERT has certainly improved incredibly, and there have been companies like ESET and Microsoft and so on, which have obviously been very helpful in trying to help them, but their own capabilities in being able to prevent the large-scale types of blackout. We saw Indestroyer a few weeks back, and it was not effective in shutting down what could have been millions of homes blacked out. So this is really a testament to the sort of resilience and the cyber capabilities in defense that Ukraine has been able to build.
So recently, General Nakasone said some stuff about not only their offensive capabilities, but the war in Ukraine and the support that they've been giving the Ukrainian armed forces from the cyber realm. What did you make of that, Melissa, of that statement, and what's been going on there?
So General Nakasone is the head of U.S. Cyber Command and the National Security Agency. So he's got a beautiful role of understanding the intelligence and being able to conduct military operations with our allies. And the hunt forward operations have been something that has been underway for a number of years. And he recently talked, actually in Estonia this week at SciCon, and he's testified before U.S. Congress. He talked about the 9 hunt forward operations and operating in 16 different countries, working with our allies. He had talked about operating in Ukraine 90 days before the war, or before the initiation of the war, of helping identify the persistent access that the Russians have in our critical infrastructures, eliminating that access and understanding what tools were used in order to gain that access. That's part of what ESET and other companies are doing, and Mandiant and others are doing a lot of analysis on, or Dragos in the United States on industrial control systems. It's really important as we get that knowledge, that we share that knowledge with everybody so that it can start to, in our industries, so they can start to eliminate the access and prevent the cause of harm in the future. So I think it's really important that we talk about it. In theory, if we talk about it, then in theory it presents some deterrence measures or makes it more difficult for somebody to get those tools and cause harm against another set of infrastructures. So I think you'll see a lot more discussion coming from the United States and from key NATO allies to talk about this, of what we're all doing together.
I'm just going to turn to some questions now from the audience. This is a good one. Wouldn't it be wise for Russia to save cyber attacks on the West for a time of kinetic attack? Should it come to it? Who wants to take that?
Yeah, actually, this is something that we've seen in many of the operations in Ukraine. While we can't directly do a one-to-one comparison and say this happened and that because this was going to happen, but what we have seen is that Russia did deploy cyber attacks in specific regions, which it then subsequently, within a day or so, deployed its kinetic capabilities. So I think it's not unreasonable. However, I would say that in these in this specific case, I think at this point the last thing that Russia will be probably thinking about is a kinetic attack on a NATO country, particularly given the current kind of unity that we see in the West. But their ability to act in the cyber realm is certainly able to be targeted and to support their kinetic ambitions.
I think you'll also see a larger deployment of their proxies, whether it's DarkSide or Ransom Evil or Rebel or the different ransomware groups, and then they'll take down key infrastructures, which is what we've seen in the U.S. and elsewhere. They hold them hostage and then raise money, and I think that you're going to see that increase in the near term against critical infrastructures.
Yeah, because at some point it's mutually assured destruction if you were to go after. I mean, obviously Russian hackers are probably in systems in the U.S. and in Europe, but if they were to, say, knock out the power grid somewhere, I mean, the same would be true in a response.
I guess it all depends on how things evolve on the battlefield in Ukraine, and how much longer the Russians will tolerate Western military assistance, which, frankly, there should be more of. Talking about mutually assured destruction, however, there's no cyber button. There's the proverbial red nuclear button, but there's no such button for cyber. So it's a very complex environment, and it's much more difficult to deter when you are in an environment where you are interconnected, where you are constantly in contact with your allies and with your civilian sector. So I would actually stress the importance of building resilience and being persistent, because they will probably be the best deterrence in the long term, or denial, rather.
I think that's actually also a very, very good point that the cyber realm is a little bit unique in terms of a theater of war, in that it is almost entirely civilian infrastructure, built on civilian systems, hosted on civilian systems, and also we live in a fairly homogenized infrastructure. So everyone's using the same switch equipment, everyone's using the same protocols, everyone's using the same operating systems. And so when you deploy a cyber weapon such as the NotPetya attack, the risk for collateral damage, even against your own capabilities, is something that has to be considered quite deeply. So I think this is also a really important thing to think about, is that you might want to be a lot more targeted than and that's not always possible.
Yeah, because NotPetya, I think one of the entities that was hit by it was Rosneft.
It was,
Like
yeah.
pretty badly too.
It actually hit more than 80 companies in Russia and the industrial systems. But again, if you don't care about the collateral damage, or you actually start to learn about your own resilience of what you need to invest in, it's very informative of how you want to evolve things.
So I know that's the name of the panel as well, or it's mentioned in it, but something I'm always hearing recently is the idea that NATO countries in the US and European countries are waking up to the fact that they're being offensive. They're doing offensive cyber attacks. I mean, is that really all that new? And why now, and why talking about it now?
There's I think, agreement among the allies that we need to start calling out the offensive actions that are happening. It's a matter of policy now. At least State Department has published it, and working with our allies, that as more that we work together of naming and shaming and talking about what's happening, then the more that we might invest in the resilience, intelligence sharing, cooperation across borders, and those things. That policy has been evolving since 2014, and really kind of, I think, really operationalized in like 2018 timeframe, 2019. And I think you'll see a lot more of it now, especially as we are all mobilized to stand and support Ukraine. And so therefore, you're going to see a lot more information flow and a lot more discussion about what's happening.
Yeah, I would say as well, like, the word has totally changed since then, but I've been always saying, like, not just offensive side, but let's become proactive in cybersecurity. That's what I mean. Like, totally becoming proactive. And what I see, especially in my current role, like managing the international relations in the MOD, especially in the cybersecurity field, I mean, it has become much more active when it's just like countries working together. And this is the exact direction that we need to go. And so, as I pointed out before in the very beginning, I mean, when we see that there is a massive change in the operations, then we need to change our steps as soon as possible as well. And this is what's happening right now.
I would add, Ben, that I work primarily in the area of cyber diplomacy. And one thing that has happened after February the 24th, and we should have seen it all coming, but it was still a shock. I think we're all a bit lost in the area of cyber diplomacy, because what has happened is that the one partner has behaved in a way which means that there's simply no even residual trust left. And how can we then try and build norms of responsible state behavior when it has become amply clear that that one actor is not willing to abide by the norms of responsible state behavior in cyber nor elsewhere? So we are at a loss of what to do, but of course, this doesn't mean that we should not give up the long-term goal of strengthening a rules-based order in cyberspace and working on the norms of responsible state behavior.
I thought, yeah, everywhere. So I said I fully agree with you as well. But when we think about now the anonymous, also hackers, what they're doing in Russia. Would you ever imagine before the war started that the response from the Western world would be that supportive than it is today? Does it also just kind of totally change when it comes to diplomatic relations in that side? Or I don't know, how do you feel about that? Like,
I think what's happening is actually quite dangerous. So what Jarmo is talking about is the United Nations government group of experts and the open-ended working group, and all of our countries have been working together to and agree upon that there is responsible state behavior in cyberspace, and one can't attack a sovereign nation and critical infrastructures. And there's a whole series of things that have been agreed to among our countries, which the trust is now gone, and Russia's lost that credibility. But I think that there's this really dangerous thing that's happening now from civil society. Ukraine mobilizing the IT army gives the target set of here's what you need to take down of Russia. That's also not within the norms of state behavior, and we might overlook it because we're in a wartime environment. But then you have other parts of civil society, Anonymous, which is a self-organized group that's creating its own target list. When you think about the key operating systems, what Andrew said, that we're all using the same things, the industrial control systems, and you're going to go after these things. You're going to take down the rail of Russia. You're going to take down the communications of Russia. They're going to take down the communications in Finland or the power in Estonia because they're all similar and connected. And so then that could really lead to escalation and miscalculation of what's happening in this environment and drag us all into a war.
Yeah, and even if, in war and love, everything is permitted. I think we need to be careful because we should not stray from the same principles of responsible state behavior that the other side has strayed from.
Because there's been talk about this for years. There's no cyber Geneva Convention. There's been no agreed upon terms thus far.
Geneva Convention is not necessarily what we have is an agreement from the government group of experts of that the laws of armed conflict and the rules of responsible state behavior apply, and we have a general agreement about that, and that therefore then means you don't attack a sovereign nation with these tools. And but I think talking about a Geneva Convention is the wrong path. And when we talk about that, I think it blurs the roles of state behavior versus the roles of other organizations.
I'll grab another audience question from Kevin Barron. I know him, Defense One. What are you learning from the conflict that the West, NATO, needs more of? Reply, cyber defenses or capabilities. Anybody, any takers on that?
I believe that over the last 25 years, we have all made decisions to connect anything and everything to the internet, and that there's pervasive vulnerability across society, and we have not invested in the defense or the resilience of our critical infrastructures upon which our countries depend upon and our militaries are going to have in a time of war. And so what we have to do is we actually have to start to change the conversation about getting to resilience, not necessarily defense. How quickly could we recover on a bad day? And the answer is not a very good one.
I think when we come back, just sort of pull back a little bit and look at, that we've just been through, or we're still in really in the sort of the aftermath of a global pandemic. And during that time, there was a lot of talk about sort of recovery and resilience funding within Europe. And this is something that was talking about digitization programs, that all of us had to move online. We were all working from home. That brings new issues for cyber defense. And so, of course, then there was a discussion about, well, we need a better digitization and so on. And there was the talk of appointing cyber czars for each country. And then when you actually look at what trickles down into the budget of each country for cybersecurity, that is not reflected in what is being said at the higher level. And I think this is the overall problem, and I think this is actually the root of this question about why haven't we seen this, cyber apocalypse or the cyber Pearl Harbor in Ukraine or afterwards in Europe. The reality is that the cyber resiliency of the world is constantly underfunded, under threat, and underdeveloped. And we do not have a very good strategy anywhere in the world to actually increase our own capabilities. We certainly don't have it in Europe to develop the the cybersecurity capabilities within our own nations to make sure that we don't have to keep having these discussions about defending our national infrastructure against a remote attack from third nation states. And we're not only talking about Russia. You know, we've been following the so-called advanced persistent threats from Chinese-speaking world, from Korean-speaking world, from the Middle East, and of course from Russia and from other areas for decades now, and we've seen only the most minimal kind of hat tip towards the national budgets of our nations reflecting this in our defense spending, but also in our capabilities for teaching in education, in our capabilities for actually building cyber resilience through our nations, and it's all very well to talk about digitization programs, it's all very well to talk about innovation and new technologies and advances in AI, but each one of these things is underpinned by the fact that all of these technologies will have vulnerability attached to them, and therefore we need to think of the cybersecurity posture as we build them, not as an afterthought.
One question I've been wondering is, how helpful or unhelpful have the big Silicon Valley companies been throughout this, this latest iteration of the conflict? I'm talking about everywhere from anyone from Facebook to Microsoft. Take your pick.
Well, I think that there's been some really interesting, like Akamai and CrowdStrike have teamed up together to help thwart off distributed denial of service attacks. So keeping everything online when somebody wants it offline. And Microsoft has done a pretty good job of identifying, the wiper viruses or trying to protect the Microsoft equipment in Ukraine and elsewhere. And then ESET and Dragos and others, Mandiant, are talking about here's the malicious software. So I think that they're doing a pretty good job of communicating, and operationally, I think the most successful thing I would say would be the Akamai CrowdStrike relationship in Ukraine, keeping them online. But the thing that's not being discussed, which is what you're trying to ask me, I think, Ben, is that all these companies have actually fielded technologies that are threaded with vulnerabilities with the principle of field it fast and fix it later. And, just look at what Patch Tuesday's got, and Microsoft is 100 usually a month, and they're all critical vulnerabilities. And so when you have these critical vulnerabilities in the information communications technology that's buried into the backbone of our economy and all these critical infrastructures, that's why we're not resilient. And that's what we have to address. We can talk about the diplomacy, we can get to offensive weapons, but until you actually drain the swamp of the technology that's in the baseline of all of our infrastructures and get them to actually field something that's well engineered and a lot less vulnerable, we're going to continue to be having this problem for the foreseeable future.
Yeah. So as you can hear, we're all coming back to the issue of resilience and persistence. Because if the threats are advanced and persistent, we need to persist ourselves. It's not going to, there will be no quick fixes out there. There's no way going back. And I've often said that we're only as strong, in a digital society, we're only as strong as our weakest link. So it's really important to also build capacity at the individual, household, business, organization, government, and all other levels, and globally. Capacity building so as to build that much needed resilience.
So I have a voice in my ear telling me that there's someone from the Ukrainian Digital Ministry who has a question. I would love to hear that. Go ahead. What's your name, sir?
My name is Vlad, and I just wanted to... Oh, yes, you have the special... So thank you very much. Hello to everyone. And in the beginning, you discussed about the beginning of the war and how it started. I just would like to add some words on this. So in Ukraine, the cyber attacks began in a month before 24th of February. Really, the first huge attacks we had in January, and some way this was a great experience for us because first of all, they tried to shut down our banking system, our registries, and our different kinds of channels of exchanging data, and at that time we were stable in January. So when in the time with the missiles and with the tanks, when we had a new wave of attacks for Ukrainian infrastructure. That time we were already ready. So our banks were really enough secured, and all of our systems were secured. And in the same time, what the experience we had, first of all, and about the blackouts or everything like that, we closed all the registries. This was our first step, and so maybe you've heard that in Ukraine we have different digital documents, and all these documents, they are not stored in the smartphones like COVID certificates in the European Union, but these documents works online with the registries. So we saved we saved documents in the smartphones, but new users could not get any documents or something like that, any public services that were connected to different registries, because we have up to 70 connections with different governmental registries, and this was our first steps that we've done that time.
Just a question to you.
Just quickly, just say your name again for the audience, everyone.
Slava. My name is Slava Banik.
Slava, thank you.
But was it correct, again, like you talked about like the attack before the war happened, and I read about this too, it wasn't just Russia, like that it linked back to, but it was also part of like Chinese influence that coming that side?
Not in huge.
Okay.
Yes, we saw some different channels and different countries, but this what I cannot tell you that Chinese has a huge role in this. So no. Firstly, Russian Federation, Iran, and they even sorry, but they even tried to use their channels from Czech Republic.
Very interesting. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'll grab another question from the audience. There's a North Korean hacking question, which whenever we're talking about this stuff, you need to have a North Korean hacking question. It's classic. North Korean cyber attacks on Sony from 2014 caused damage in tens of millions of dollars while costing incomparably less to conduct. How do we deal with disproportionality between cost to conduct and damage cyber attacks can cause?
It's a resilience question again. You know, I think it was a wake-up call for that industry. You know, obviously there were a series, not just that one attack on Sony, but there were a series of attacks on Sony, on their infrastructure, on their across their businesses, and I think they probably learned quite a lot from that. But the reality is it does come down to resilience, but it is an asymmetric warfare. You know, like the attacker has endless amounts of time to develop their attack, and you have seconds to defend. And this is why, you know, companies like ESET, and others in our industry spend our time researching new methods of detection or new methods of predicting attacks, building, you know, large-scale machine learning models, upstepping our cyber threat intelligence capabilities, building, you know, large-scale networks of sensors and telemetry where we can start to see this type of activity on a global scale, because you have seconds to react. With it, you know, the NotPetya attack happened in minutes, and it was down, and companies like Merck MSD were down for 2 months, not able to manufacture medications. These are huge problems and vulnerabilities, and it is asymmetric. And the only way that we can, in the long term, reduce our vulnerability is by considering security as a first step to any plan, rather than as an add-on, as a bolt-on, or a nice thing to have. You know, cybersecurity is not a luxury; it's an essential.
Yeah. And that actually needs to be understood in the boardroom. All companies today are tech companies, and what this means is that it's not a silo. This is not a silo. This needs to be understood and internalized at the CEO level, because otherwise businesses will continue to be vulnerable.
Yeah, I agree with that. And when I talk about this, it's all businesses are digital businesses, and they need to understand their digital dependencies. And so, and ICTs are commodities, right? So, these computers and phones have to be replaced, every 5 to 7 years. And we're treating them as if they're capital assets. They're going to last 25 years, which is part of the problem of, the NotPetya, that the legacy technologies that are in our core infrastructures or manufacturing, they're 100% vulnerable 100% of the time because they're no longer supported with hardware or software updates. And then the companies that are the technologies that we have that are supported, Microsoft, a Cisco or whatever, of a current operating system, they have to be patched on a monthly or some other cadence in order to keep them so that they're not 100% vulnerable. That's a high operational cost. So you got a capital cost, you have an operational cost, and the CEOs in most of the companies do not really understand that they're digital businesses and they're not investing in the resilience of their critical businesses and services.
They also don't disclose when they are hacked, largely, which is a terrible problem.
That's changing. In the United States, as you may know, the Security and Exchange Commission is posting a rule, and I think it'll go final in July, that all companies will have to report an incident within 4 days of it happening. We passed a law in the United States that all companies have to report an incident if they're critical infrastructure, which pretty much is everything, within 72 hours. And then the SEC rule is going to require a board member has to be a digital expert, that they've got to have proven governance, et cetera. So I think the United States, at least at this point, usually we follow Europe on certain things. This time we're leading, and your companies will have to follow.
Actually, in Estonia, you already are, by the law, you have to also report about your cyber attacks immediately when you're critical infrastructure providers. I think it has been working already for the last at least 5 years or so.
Yeah, that's the
so
Network
it's in
Information
place.
Security
Yeah.
Directive.
So we also, but I would add it up here as well. Just it is a government's responsibility to make sure that our companies really do also have enough knowledge in order to protect themselves as well. And this is what we've been also trying to change our mindset on that side and to really also provide support as much as possible. And just to bring it out, like one of the projects that we're currently running at the MOD, so we have a foundation called CR14. And under there, we open like a new project together with Norway, which is called OCR. Open cyber range, so that we open our cyber ranges also to private companies, so that if there is a new company and they want to test their solutions or products or just to see how it works, is it resilient, then we open our government's cyber range so that they can test it there. We can attack them and see the weakest points so that they can improve their systems as well. And I think this is exactly how they should move on, so that we do support the companies in the process. And but I agree again with both of you that it always just starts from the CAO level. They need to see the need in order to protect themselves, because what we have seen also in Ukraine, usually not even the government organizations are hit the worst, but the banking sector, critical infrastructure providers. So in order to keep up the states and keep that working, so we need to really support the private.
Especially in this kind of very, very interconnected world, you have very long and very complex supply chains, and they have, you may have your organization very secure, but your supply chain may not be, and that can introduce other types of vulnerabilities. And I think to address this sort of legislative approach, I think this is what NIS2 is really attempting to do here in Europe. The concern is always the implementation at the end. You don't want to end up with 27 different implementations of a legislation, which is a complex thing. But it has improved, and it has improved the requirements for certain types of businesses and certain types of infrastructure to report these types of incidents. So that is improving, and I agree that reporting is a really important part of it. But also, to make the board more aware of it at this sort of sea level, you do have to have some kind of penalty. You need to have usually the thing that talks most in the boardroom is what's the effect on my budget. And if the effect on my budget is I have to spend $200,000-300,000 on cybersecurity, or I have to pay 15 million in fines, maybe I'm going to think more about the cybersecurity, at least after I got the first fine. So this is an approach that can help, but it's also systemic, as as has been said. This is every business is an IT business at this point. and everything, and it has to be thought about from that perspective, and everything has to be introduced into your business as if you are introducing a new vulnerability. So when you bring it into your business, you are introducing a new vulnerability into that business.
So one thing that has been talked about Russian hackers for a long time in the last few years is disinformation. And obviously, General Nakasone actually mentioned it in that interview that he gave to Sky, and that this has been a problem. They've taken efforts against it. So I'm wondering, for anyone on the panel here, how has disinformation, Russian disinformation, troll farms, how's it played into this particular conflict?
If I may start, there's the saying that in times of war, truth is the first casualty. And if you go back, 10, 15 years, you see that truth has increasingly been compromised, not only in Ukraine, but everywhere globally, and especially in open societies. So that kind of raises the question, have we been at war for the past 10 to 15 years? Because truth has clearly been a casualty of the disinformation campaigns that have been directed at us. Second point, malicious cyber activity is usually part of a broader disinformation, broader hybrid campaign. And disinformation is a crucial part of that. Again, I'm coming back to my third point. We need to come back to resilience. We need to build societies that are resilient to disinformation, and societies that value truth and value science, because otherwise we will be lost.
And Melissa, actually, I wanted to ask you this. When General Nakasone mentioned that, were they saying that they're kind of particularly looking at those farms and trying to take them out per se? Is that something that you think that they're doing?
Yeah, well, so General Nakasone has been open about the operations conducted against the Russian internet agency, the RA, and halting certain things. The troll farms are really troubling. They're operating everywhere, and so they're very sophisticated, using artificial intelligence, understanding what channel you're listening to, or what your proclivity is basically from a political perspective, or what you're worried about. And then they're specifically targeting, your Facebook or your whatever channel you're in, and then feeding you the information. And so I think that that it's really sowing that discord, and I agree 100%. I mean, the truth is eroding, and we as a society are choosing only one or two channels and not looking for a broader set of information in order to make informed decisions. And so if you can start to play to the fears of people and continue to feed that information to play the fear to be more extreme, then you are going to sow discord. And it should be very worrisome to all of us, because the disinformation is only going to get worse as we move into more social media channels, into the meta. There will be certainly manipulation of our hearts and minds and playing to our fears to get us to be not unified.
I mean, now we have TikTok, TikTok is also an avenue of disinformation, so they seem to keep coming up as well.
Ben, I have a rhetorical question to you, and maybe to everybody else. Should we sanction Tucker Carlson?
Well, as an objective member of the media, I will have to say that I'm going to let the authorities deal with that and the independent companies. But of course, I think any journalist or claimed journalist should be subject to, the truth.
Yeah. I'm not saying that we should, but I think it's a fair question.
There's definitely, this has come up recently, especially if you're looking at something like Elon Musk's takeover of Twitter and whether or not that's going to really affect things. And obviously one major Twitter account might come back if that were the case. So, and how that will affect the disinformation environment.
I think anyone who has spent long enough in working with or talking to media has been misquoted, and I think that also that sort of there is clearly an angle that media has. They want to tell a story, and that doesn't always mean that all of the facts fit that story nicely or that narrative, or they just want to. And so there's a level of from slightly, altering or massaging something to fit something to creating a completely different narrative. But one of the things that has always been and is inevitable and is in some senses is not so much of a problem. I think the problem now is the speed at which misinformation and disinformation can actually spread very, very rapidly. So you can have something that has been misreported either deliberately or otherwise or mistakenly, which can spread very, very quickly. You now have the introduction of technologies like AI technology where you can create deep fakes, where you can recreate someone's voice perfectly, you can recreate their image almost perfectly. And so as we progress forward, that is going to become a higher issue, but that will actually put a lot of pressure on governments to come up with solutions. And technology in that case is also a possibility for solution. Estonia uses blockchain to verify every output from the government to say this is the official document and you can show it on the blockchain because it's signed and we know that this really came and this is the original source. And then it comes to a generational problem of retraining our young children in schools to understand how to source information. When I was in my school days, we didn't have Wikipedia. We had to go to the library. When I wanted to find something in my university, I would go to the library, research it in the book, quote the source, and all of these. So you had to use multiple sources of information. Now, I'll just Google something, and the first result that is promoted to me is the one that I'll tend to see and probably believe, because on balance, it's probably right. So we then have to, I think, kind of bring this educational aspect, and this is a long-term thing which no politician ever likes, because it's not a 4-year solution, but it's a generational problem, And the great thing is that our young people, that some of whom are here already, the Gen Z, the millennial generation, and the young children who are growing now are growing up in this digital age. So they have the psychology already to be able to start to understand that. And I think we owe it to them as the generation who sort of created this mess for them to give them the tools to help them to understand security, digital privacy, their rights, the way to source information, how to define truth, how to test science, how to know what is real, and how to make good decisions about the leaders that they elect to lead them, so that we don't have these problems going on for further generations.
Switching gears a little bit, Anett, you mentioned earlier that Ukraine has become a testing ground. We're learning so much from Ukrainians. But I guess one thing we generally in media we're not talking about enough is, what do you think states that aren't necessarily all that friendly to NATO and European nations are learning about us throughout this conflict from cyberspace?
They definitely are, yes. I mean, everybody's are in a current conflict as well. And then so, yeah, we can't deny that there is also other people looking at what's happening and taking their lessons from there. But that's again on our table to really focus on doing better. And again, when it comes to collectively responding to these cases as well, and just again doing as much as exercises and operations and all of that together, then maybe we are a little bit stronger in that side, so that our knowledge can kind of lead on that side. So yeah, I'm not going to lie and say that we are the only ones that are learning from this Ukrainian lesson right now.
Yeah, because the question I have is how China must be learning a lot from this. They have to be.
They are, and they are one of the best countries when it comes to also cybersecurity field as well. Very smart. So definitely all the eyes are currently on what's happening there. And as I said, because I was reading that news as well, and that China has been part of also influencing what's happening in Ukraine, also in cyberspace, and that doesn't surprise us. They've been in some kind of also government portals for years, and in other NATO members as well. So
we've seen certainly a pivot of some of these threat actors pivoting from China their focus on, let's say, Southeast Asia, focus towards more Eastern Europe and Ukraine, but more on a kind of espionage level rather than in a cyber attack level. Because, for instance, it's very useful information to know what's being destroyed in a country that you can then offer to rebuild. And if we look at Africa, the amount of infrastructure that China has provided to Africa under various agreements, and let's say exporting their diplomacy, exporting their way of perhaps building things and their network equipment and their own IT capabilities and perhaps their form of government will change the face of Africa. And unfortunately, I think this is the sort of the extended face of let's say globalism. The next step is towards picking the gems out of the treasure box of Africa. Without ever really giving them the benefit of perhaps the sort of the values that could come with that. And I think that's a major failure of the Western world.
Yeah. I think this conversation proves once again that cyber and digital are just two sides of the same coin. Because what you just said reminds me of what Commissioner Vestager said yesterday on the big podium. And one thing that she said was that technological standards do impact the values that societies are built on. And it's a constant battle or struggle to ensure that the human-centric and human rights-based values that we all share here are also the values of the future for the developing world.
And that requires us to have a longer view, and it also requires us to step up and be more leaders in these areas. I think that we generally have had a laissez-faire approach. Certainly the Americans have, that our companies will do it for us. And that's not the case. So if we really want to shape the future environment, we as leaders of governments working with industry have to cooperate and do it together. Otherwise, it will be reshaped and on our watch.
Jarmo, I got a question for you very specifically. Obviously, Finland is going to be joining NATO, or is possibly joining NATO. What does Finland learn from the cyber realm and its dealings with Russia that will help the alliance?
Well, firstly, there's a very broadly shared political will across the political spectrum to join NATO, and there's no going back. We will join sooner or later, and together with Sweden. What have we learned? I think the learning has come more from the disinformation and hybrid context than cyber alone. And what we have learned is that, again, sorry to be repeating this over and over again, but resilience counts. Media literacy, which is part of resilience, counts. It starts at school. We actually teach media literacy at school to Finnish kids. What we have also learned is that Russia, as an actor in cyber, and we're not the only ones to have learned that, they have much less regard for consequences. It's much more of a reckless posture than, say, China. But it's been predominantly about the lessons that we have learned in hybrid warfare, which a couple of years back also included immigration across the borders. And we need to be ready also at the legislative level to meet all possible contingencies, such as uncontrolled immigration across the border, instigated and facilitated by our neighbor.
Thank you. With that, I'm going to thank everyone for all the panelists for joining me. It's a really interesting discussion. And I also want to remind everyone here, there is another panel coming on very shortly called Rethinking the Global Energy Order in a New Geopolitical Landscape. So stick around. Thank you.
Moderator of the session, Eleanor Wragg.
Thank you very much for joining us for this panel on building a backup grid, rethinking energy in a new geopolitical landscape. My name's Eleanor Wragg, and I'm a senior reporter with Global Trade Review. Now, I think it kind of goes without saying, right, but the implications of the Russian war in Ukraine have generated a renewed level of attention globally to the weaknesses inherent in our supply of energy. So in this session, we're going to discuss the urgency of the energy transition. We'll discuss what needs to be done to avoid creating new dependencies on autocratic regimes. And we'll also look at what the future shape of global energy policy should be. So without further ado, I'd like to bring our speakers to the stage, please. So Kirsten Westphal, Vladimir Milov, Mary Warlick, and Glenn Schmidt. Now, just to remind all of the audience, we do encourage audience participation. So throughout this session, please do send your questions in via the GlobSec app, or, you know, the old-fashioned way, put your hands up, and I'll get round to you. So I think we'll start with the risks. We've seen recently how Gazprom has cut off gas supplies to Poland, Bulgaria, Finland, as well as to firms in Netherlands, Denmark, and Germany. And we heard from EU Energy Commissioner Kadri Simpson recently, who said that we're facing a situation where any one of the EU member states could be next. However, there was a recent letter from George Soros to Mario Draghi, where he highlighted Europe's vital importance to Russia for its gas exports, basically saying that Russia has very little choice, has a lack of flexibility in its gas storage, limited ability to divert supplies. So question first to Vladimir. How strong is Vladimir Putin's bargaining position? What's the real risks here to EU member states?
Well, first I have to say, you don't have to overestimate or underestimate Putin's strength. He still has some capability to last for quite some time. Yeah. He still has a lot of leverage on Europe, energy-wise, with or without the embargo. But yes, you're right, there's a fundamental weakness because of a lack of infrastructure, particularly when we're talking about natural gas. We simply cannot divert our gas export flows to basically anywhere, because Gazprom for years has been relying on this pipeline system which links it to the European market, but not anywhere else. There's been a lot of talk in the past decades that we're going to divert our gas flows to China. Anything that was achieved here is construction of one pipeline from two very remote eastern Siberian fields, which are not even connected to the rest of the system and are thousands of miles away, essentially in the middle of nowhere. So to divert gas flows from Western Siberia, the main producing region, to Asia, to China, anywhere in that direction, will take hundreds of billions of dollars of investment. a huge amount of time. We discussed this with the conference participants during the day, and I said that, listen, if they haven't launched a project of building that infrastructure to China right now, in the next few months, it means that we won't see major natural gas supplies to China in a decade.
Right.
So we can safely forget about that. So if the US will go as far to impose a gas embargo on Russia, that will be a huge blow to Vladimir Putin. He's going to be deprived of significant export revenue. The picture is slightly different with oil, I can elaborate on that. But yes, it's a consumer market, and Europe does have significant leverage. Sometimes it underappreciates that.
Exactly. I think that's a really good point. And it leads me nicely over to you, Kirsten. I wanted to get a feel from you about the kind of scenario planning that policymakers are doing. You know, what we're seeing now is this intersection, right, of climate policy and energy policy. So how is this shifting landscape affecting that?
I mean, it's hugely affecting, of course, and we knew from for quite some time that we actually have the tools to, address both climate change as well as energy security, because, green electrons and green molecules are the answer. And we have a range of technologies, so that is widely known. What are the governments right now doing with regards to scenario planning? Yes. I think what we have to understand is that we have to understand energy security in a different way in the years and decades to come, because I had the pleasure and honor to work with Irina on the report of geopolitics of energy transformation and the subsequent report on the hydrogen factor. And what this tells us is that the energy world will be much more regional and much more heterogeneous. So what I'm trying to say is that I think we have to, here in Europe, really address the issue by thinking back to our roots, thinking back how we started with the European Community for Coal and Steel, because I would say it's now we need another big bang to really address steel and our energy supplies. And by doing that, I mean, I wouldn't talk too much about the scenario planning, actually, because Vladimir also mentioned infrastructure is key. So I think we have to really understand that we have to look as governments, or the governments have to look into the enabling infrastructure. So the grids, electricity grids, and we have to work through how electricity affects geopolitics, because this is sometimes very much overlooked. And then, of course, the whole issue of connectivity with regards to hydrogen, and not only pipes, but also logistical chains. So to me, it's really an issue about infrastructure right now.
Yeah. I think the point there about the enablers, right, is a very interesting one. Now, the International Energy Agency came up with a plan, a 10-point plan to reduce the EU's reliance upon Russian natural gas. And so in that plan, there's a range of complementary actions talking about, drawing on other energy sources, looking for other suppliers, and accelerating, as you mentioned, sort of the efforts to provide consumers with clean energy. What are the challenges to carrying out this plan, and what needs to happen for it to be a success?
Well, thanks so much for the question. And let me just start off with a sentence that's probably very obvious to everyone, but there's no question that Russia's invasion of Ukraine has very much changed the global energy landscape. And as we speak, global markets are still in quite a lot of turmoil. So there's no question that this has introduced a whole set of challenges, but also, I would say, opportunities. So I'm just going to touch on a couple of those first, which I think, if anything else, among other factors, the turmoil in the markets has really underscored the importance of energy diversification, addressing energy security in new and different ways. But I think it's also underscored, and this is a point that we really make strongly at the IEA, the importance of accelerating the clean energy transition to ensure that we don't remain dependent forever on fossil fuels, and certainly not from one supplier. And what's interesting is I think that we have a variety of both of economic factors, of sort of growing consensus on the climate commitments, as well as a real strong desire to ensure we're ensuring our energy security, that could maybe move us in a faster and more secure direction in that regard. Very strong clean energy technologies are already on the market. A lot of progress is being made with solar and wind, and it's becoming much more competitive in terms of price, certainly in this environment. And so, as I said, I think with the conversion on the climate side as well, very much driving a lot of decisions that our countries are making, including in the energy sector, we do stand a chance of achieving, Paris climate goals of 2 degrees Celsius or even lower if commitments made thus far are implemented. So that's just one thing on the opportunity side. And in terms of the challenges, yes, of course, many of the things that we've suggested in our 10-point plan, which whether it's investing even more in renewables and looking for new sources of gas and other energy sources, do require real commitment in terms of policy, but also in terms of investment and financing. So implementation is absolutely key, right? It's one thing to spell out 10 points and a guide on how to do things, but the real question is how to make that all happen. And I'll just add that in addition to our 10-point plan on gas, we've issued one on oil as well. And on gas, we're working quite closely with the European Union and member states in connection with their Repower EU plan, to help them achieve real results and make progress on some of these policy commitments. And I'll just add, of course, accelerating investment in clean energy technologies in the solar, wind, heat pumps, and all of those things is really important. But energy efficiency, I think, is an area where much more gains can be achieved. And so we really underscore that as well. And on the project side, streamlining permitting and regulatory issues that have held up, I think, some projects in the past. So in any regard, I think this can be done, and real focus on demand reduction, in our view, is very important.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. Now, you mentioned there about investment in the clean energy sector. And with that, I'd like to turn to you, Glenn, because I think we need to reflect a little bit on the role of critical raw materials, right? That are going to be required to bring forth this energy transition that we really need. Now, the automotive sector is already sort of in the midst of the transition, right? How do you see this moving forward, given the current geopolitical landscape?
Yeah, thanks for raising that issue, because I think next to the issue of energy, there's the underlying issue of raw materials as well. And the automotive industry is in the midst of a big push now to promote electric mobility. Mm-hmm. And I think the positive side of the equation is it's really no longer a product issue. Not just BMW, but all the competitors in this space are. Thanks. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So next to the.
Could you just repeat a little bit, just for the guys who are watching us online?
Yeah. So thanks for raising the issue, because I think next to the whole energy debate, there's another underlying debate, and that is really raw materials. Mm-hmm. And the automotive industry is in the midst of a big push towards electric mobility, and it's certainly no longer, from our perspective, a product issue. BMW already has a wide variety of fully electric vehicles or plug-in hybrids on the markets. Yeah. Our competitors have similar products on the market as well. And if you look at the automotive industry, there's really competition around electric mobility, even maybe competition around the broader scope of climate as well as sustainability, right? And that competitive force, I think, is a force that you can't underestimate. But what the series of crises that we've experienced over the last 2.5 years really demonstrates is the global economy and our supply chains are very, very interconnected. They're probably more interconnected than the world feels right now politically, right? So if you take the example of battery electric vehicles, you have zero tailpipe emissions, but if you're not doing the conversion correctly, you're actually increasing CO2 because you're emitting more CO2 during the production phase when you're producing the battery cells or you're harvesting the raw materials. And the EU Commission in July of last year made a proposal to reduce CO2 of the new car fleet by 2035 to 100%, which virtually means the death of the internal combustion engine. And you have to realize, of course, where are we going to be getting the resources that we need for the batteries? 70% of the cost of a battery is raw materials, and these raw material prices have increased enormously. Since the 24th of February, the price of lithium, for example, has skyrocketed. 500% price increase. And we have to ask ourselves the questions, where are these raw materials coming from? These raw materials are coming from outside of the EU. These mines are not being controlled predominantly by EU companies. And it's not just the ownership of the mines, it's also the processing, it's the refining capacity as well. And I think before the EU makes a decision to turn one technology off and to focus or put all your eggs onto one basket in terms of battery electric mobility, you really do need a master plan to go in that direction. I have not seen an EU master plan for 2035 in terms of getting these resources. The EU, and this is one of the messages that I have right at the outset, the EU needs to have a more aggressive raw materials foreign diplomacy type of policy. And the same thing applies also to energy. Other countries have done this over years or decades very strategically, in a very controlled, in a very long-term type of fashion, and that has given them the position that they have currently. So think about how things are interconnected. It may sound good to be killing all other technologies and going in the direction of battery electric mobility, but at the same time, what is it doing in terms of emissions? What is it doing in terms of creating new dependencies in terms of raw materials? We really need to be taking a holistic approach.
Absolutely. And I wanted to kind of jump off from that because China is a core player, as we know, in green tech. The market is disproportionately impacted by China-based supply chains and decisions made in Beijing. So as with Russia, this creates a risk, right, of over-dependence on an autocratic power. What needs to be taken into account to ensure that Europe doesn't simply replace one problem with another? Kirsten, any thoughts from you on that?
Well, I could start because, you addressed that to me, and I'm happy to take that up. I think it is very important what the previous speakers have said. I mean, the energy transition will be much more technology-driven. Yeah. So this changes the whole texture and the whole dynamics because the resource is made with during the stage of conversion, so we have to rely on technologies. And we tend now with the shock that the invasion of Russia into Ukraine gives to the energy world, look into the geopolitical picture and ask what are the partners we have to look to and work with, and whether they are authoritarian regimes or not. I think that's extremely important as kind of paradigms, but what we also need is kind of a geoeconomic approach and a geotechnological one, because we will be in a race over value creation in a sense. And I think the point and the leading paradigm has to be somehow sovereignty. Don't talk about independence, but rather driven and targeted diversification, and also diversification of supplies of raw materials. And of course, we have then to look into China and go through the value chains. And I think this is an immediate challenge that we've also seen during the Corona pandemic. And this is why I really always come back to the point that of course Europe has to address the issue not only quote unquote under terms of energy transformation, but it's really an industrial revolution. And I also think that we have, as Glenn said, but also the other colleagues, we have to think through, maybe not in a holistic term, but also thinking through the issue of circular economy. Recycling is highly important, and it has, of course, back and forth effects on the energy consumption as well.
Exactly. I think that's a really, really interesting point. Now, there's a few questions coming through here, and all of them are quite similar, and it leads me on to a question actually that I had for Mary. So within the IEA's 10-point plan that it put forward, there were also some sort of side suggestions that don't quite align with the European Green Deal. One of those was, maybe prolonging things like coal or nuclear power as a way to sort of bridge our way across. Now, there's also been calls by some in Germany to do that. Do you think that coal and nuclear are feasible alternatives? You know, what trade-offs need to be made? I think, Mary, if I go with you, but then I'd like to open it up to the rest of you as well.
Maybe 2 points. I would say, first of all, I think we recognize that these are unique circumstances and that it's just really critical at this point in time for countries to be able to keep their citizens' lights on and keep the homes heated, and again, thinking ahead to the winter season coming up later this year, to be well prepared as that moves forward. So I think we recognize there's a certain reality to the fact that emissions, well, they already are increasing. Last year, I believe the emissions were higher than they've been in quite some time. And so that may well be a pattern that we see this year as well. I think it's important to keep an eye, though, not only on sort of immediate needs, but the long term, which is why I mentioned, and we've expressed some concerns about, moving too quickly to invest longer term in fossil fuels, right? We may need them today, but investing in new fields, we don't believe is the smart thing to do. On nuclear, a number of countries are beginning to take a fresh look at that, precisely because although it's been somewhat controversial in the past for various reasons, and some countries are still hesitating, it is a fuel that is low or close to none in terms of emissions, and so can be a good contributor in terms of an overall energy picture in an effort to reach climate and emissions reduction goals. So I think it's important to look at, as I said, both the short term and the longer term, be wise about the longer term investments we're making, while recognizing that in the short term there may be some solutions that are a little unavoidable.
Exactly. Vladimir, I'd like to take that over to you. What sort of trade-offs do you see?
Listen, I think it's inevitable that in the current situation, when we have these problems with Russia, some temporary coal revival will eventually happen. There's absolutely nothing good in it. Zero positives. Everything is bad about coal. And also, I mean, there is so much associated cost which is not normally included in the analysis. Like, for instance, if you photograph a coal power station from space, you see a lot of land attached for simply storage of the coal itself and then the ash. And then there's a lot of headache and costs inflicted by that. But this is probably inevitable, but this is temporary. So I understand that we will have to pay the price from, decoupling from dependence on Russian natural gas. On nuclear, listen, I'm a long-standing non-believer. Before the nuclear industry, we were mostly talking about, prolonging the age of some existing reactors which were supposed to be shut down. But building something new, before the nuclear industry even comes up with some ideas, then begin construction, like 10 years will pass with huge cost overruns and so on. So yeah, I understand that some of the supporters of nuclear are raising their heads because of what's going on. But I used to regulate this industry for ages, and I'm certainly skeptical that they will be able to deliver fast and cheap. So I think it's mostly a talk about the revival of nuclear power. I would like to add a few words on China. I think that we should not discuss this in a linear manner, because China is raising autocratic power. It is at odds with the West on many issues, so we should treat it in the same way as Russia. I'm by no means a fan of the Chinese Communist Party, but China is also very different. It's not a disruptive actor to such extent as Russia is. It had really benefited from a global order of the past 3 and 4 decades, and also strongly dependent on Western markets. So there is a lot of negativity between Western democracies and China now, but it's also manageable, because China also has its interests. It's intertwined with the Western system, and the West has a lot of leverage. We see, for instance, how China is effectively, quietly joining a secondary sanctions against Russia, and is not helping Russian aggression beyond some rhetoric, because it's more interested in its relations with the West. So any risks associated with China are manageable, And here we come again to the issue that Western countries should more appreciate the extent of leverage that they have also in these relations. And this idea of raw materials diplomacy also is very good. If this leverage is used in a consolidated manner, it works.
Absolutely. I think there's some really important points that you've raised there, in particular, you know, coming up with short-term solutions to long-term problems and vice versa. One of the other kind of tabled solutions has been the demand side. You know, we're talking about consumers turning their heating down, looking at sort of energy savings. And I wanted to bring this up with you, Glenn, because obviously the private sector is the biggest consumer of energy. What can industry do to sort of be more efficient in the way that it consumes energy? And what kind of dialogue are you having with governments at the moment?
Yeah. Well, we're having a...
Just a hand.
Is my mic working now? My head
It
mic?
is not, sadly.
It's not working. Okay, then I'll have to
Sorry.
refer to this. Maybe there's some semiconductor... It's working? Okay, yeah. Maybe it's a semiconductor issue. So I think industry, of course, has to bear the burden with a lot of these things, and government sets the targets and sets the policies, but ultimately it's industry that needs to implement and do these things. Right. I think industry can contribute by being more efficient, right? And so we need to be thinking about new production processes, new methods to reduce the amount of energy that we're consuming.
Yeah.
And right now in Germany, we of course have the discussion how to reduce the dependency on gas coming from Russia. And since the outbreak of the war, that dependency has gone down from 55 to 35%, so 20% reduction. And industry is working closely together with government to come up with plans to say, how can we reduce the amount of gas that we need? So that's one big contributing factor as well. I think the other point is industry needs to be using opportunities at a very regional level as well. And diversification, I think, is one of the best plans. You know, if you put all of your eggs in one basket, sorry that I'm using this analogy again, but if you're relying on gas from Russia as your main route as a transition for energy, and something like this happens, then you are in a situation where you need to suddenly rely on alternatives that are far more inferior, right? And the approach that we're trying to take at BMW is to kind of use what we have at our doorstep, right? So for example, our plant in Leipzig, Eastern Germany, there we have a pipeline with hydrogen that we want to be connecting as well. We also have wind energy. 2 days ago, on the 1st of June, we had the groundbreaking for our new plant in Hungary, in Debrecen, where we will be producing all-electric vehicles. And this will be the first plant that we have that does not rely on fossil fuel energy at all. So we'll be relying on geothermic energy, on wind, and also water, hydroelectric energy as well. So if you do this transition correctly, you're being more efficient, you're also becoming autark, relying on less, and you're becoming more resilient as well. And I mean, to answer your question, bottom line, industry needs to be delivering the innovation to deliver on all of these goals, right?
Exactly. Thank you very much. How then, just sort of leading on from that, how then do we expect to see governments and industry working together? Because often they have competing objectives, right? What needs to be done to forge better partnerships between industry and government? I don't know, Kirsten, if you have any thoughts on that.
I would come back really to the point of the enabling infrastructure, which I really think is key. Yeah. At least from out of Germany, from the perspective, it's key that that the electricity lines are established, that we have to think through how a hydrogen grid should look like, who and how can the European hydrogen backbone be financed. There are all these issues around really not only scenario, but I would really say now go deep into network planning, and integrated network planning is actually key, both on a systemic level, thinking through electricity, gas, hydrogen, and also heat, but also I would say on the regional level or local level to have spaces for learning and experiments how to green and decarbonize industrial clusters. And this is basically the idea also by the important projects of common European interest for hydrogen. So start with hydrogen valleys and clusters, and then work in concentric circles to connect these clusters. And not only physically, but also I would say what is really needed, so at least from the hydrogen point of view, is to quickly start and accelerate, but also leapfrog into a market. Because I think the big opportunities we can really harvest from green electricity and green molecules is the decentralization issue. But in order to do that, you need third-party access quite quickly, both to storages and to the grids and the pipelines. And therefore, I think we need quickly price signals. We need, of course, the regulation that Mary addressed is really key, and certification for hydrogen. And this is actually what H2 Global is also trying to deliver, a kind of reference tool and a kind of reference in terms of, well, standards, norms, and prices. But I think this is really key, and this is also a point where, of course, governments and industry have to work together, both on local level but also on the systemic level. And I wouldn't underestimate the issue of providing a platform for exchange, because it's exactly introducing new technologies means bringing together also the suppliers, the small and medium-sized enterprises, and therefore I really think we need quite innovative forms of exchange and platforms in Europe.
Yeah. Over to you, Mary.
No, I just build on that by saying the IEA has developed and issued a number of global net zero road mapping reports over the last year. We started with a global net zero roadmap for the energy sector, and subsequently have done a couple of additional reports, one for China on achieving carbon neutrality by 2060. Our global net zero roadmap was focused on 2050. And many countries now around the world brought to Glasgow, to the COP in November, new commitments to achieve net zero by 2050 or other such goals. Our modeling shows that we have available today the necessary technologies to achieve our interim goals by 2030, but the technologies needed to get to 2050 are still not available on the market. So it really underscores how critical it is, if we're really serious about our climate and emissions reduction goals, that huge, significant investments still need to be made in terms of innovation and technology to get there. And it will absolutely require not only big investments on the part of governments, but government-industry collaboration.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the interesting things here is that out of any crisis, there are opportunities, right? And you've just mentioned COP26, all of the industry, all of the corporations talking about all of these goals that they were going to achieve. Obviously, the current situation has, I assume, injected a little bit more urgency into that. And Glenn, I just wanted to check in with you. You know, how has the war sort of changed industry's view on energy security? You know, you've recently talked about the plant that you're doing in Leipzig and so on. You're looking to do more. But is that indicative of everyone in the industry? What are you seeing?
Yeah. Well, I think in terms of the crisis, maybe one step back, I think you can sort of look at it as 3 acts or 3 chapters, because it sort of started off with the global pandemic, right, which started in Asia and then moved over to the West, which disrupted supply chains. Then the second issue, and we experienced that 10 minutes ago, was the semiconductor shortage, right? And that was an interesting thing to observe. You see increased demand because of digitalization, electrified products as well. And then you have a shortage, and that paralyzes a lot of the supply chain. And then now you have the brutal war in the Ukraine as well, which is putting raw materials and energy on the agenda as well. So the thing is, none of these chapters is concluded, right? They just continue, right? The pandemic is still an issue in China as well. And I think it has changed the way industry thinks. You know, we're becoming more conscious of how international and how global our value chain is. I've been hearing a lot from a lot of participants in the market, globalization isn't working. We have to give up on globalization. And I think that would be the wrong approach. I think that would be very sad, not just for industry, but also for our children and for next generations, because government and business has always been able to build bridges, right? And even though you may have political differences, business and economic cooperation can really still bind together. You know, we always refer to it as dependencies. Yeah. But ultimately, it's a mutual relationship as well. I mean, I could say my wife is dependent on me, or my wife, I'm dependent on my wife, but it's actually a relationship that you're going into, right? And it would be wrong to isolate China, We still need to be having the discussions with China and cooperating at an economic level. But at the same time, to answer your question, I think it would be wrong to be completely ignorant and to think that globalization can continue the way it is or has over the last decades. We still need to be thinking in terms of regional supply chains. So I think business is thinking more regionally, China, Asia, Europe, the Americas. How can you regionalize supply chains? How can you bring semiconductor technology to markets? How can you bring, for example, raw materials to these markets? And other players, in the Asians, have been more, I don't think aggressive is the right word. They've been more strategic.
Right.
They've been more strategic and more defined. And we need to be thinking in those terms as well.
Absolutely, absolutely. If anyone has anything else to add on that.
Yeah, because this is exactly why I also mentioned the energy world or even the industrial world will be more regionalized. And in talking about Europe does not only focus at the EU, but at really the broader neighborhood. I think we need, of course, the Baltic Sea, the North Sea, if you think about renewable generation, but also the Mediterranean, and of course, looking into Ukraine. So I think, the regional focus is a very important one. And also the point on not getting rid and independent from China, I think is a very important one, because you asked for trade-offs some minutes ago. And I think that's exactly the point. There is a strong trade-off between speed and depth of decarbonization, but also of getting rid of China. We need the cheap solar panels in order to quickly decarbonize the industry. So it's a sensitive balance that we have to manage, actually, both industries and governments.
Absolutely.
And maybe one thought, if I can just throw it in there as well. I mean, if there's a lot of global tension and there are a lot of differences between the very regions. But if you look at it very objectively, there is maybe one element, kind of one common denominator, which maybe has the potential to kind of be the next kind of global language, and that is the push to decarbonize and the push towards sustainability, right? The EU Green Deal is extremely ambitious. The EU wants to be the first climate neutral continent. The Biden administration has very ambitious targets as well. And China also has targets as well. They're 10 years behind the EU. But this is an area where there's a potential for cooperation, right? And through cooperation comes understanding and exchange of ideas and thoughts as well. And green tech is on the agenda of all three regions, right? So there's potential there for more understanding and more cooperation.
Absolutely. We've got some really good questions coming in. I'm going to pick one up here from Ben Muller, and this is a question for Vladimir. Ben says, the president of Serbia said yesterday that it is simply not possible for Europe to decouple itself from Russian natural resources. Is this true? Are we condemned to perpetually fund Putin's war machine?
But of course it is possible. And we could have seen in the past 20 years how major European economies like Germany in the first place are decoupling very fastly, developing renewable electricity production, which is in double-digit dozens of percentage points in German electricity generation mix right now. It simply wasn't the case 20 years ago. So I think that we should really look at the fact that some economies simply do not want to follow that pattern. That's their deliberate choice, like Italy or the Netherlands, to continue to rely on natural gas and not sufficiently invest in development of renewables. Germany did it and was relatively successful, and I think this is one of the reasons now why the German government position is rapidly shifting. Maybe not as rapidly as some wanted, but if you look at the history of German politics, that's a tectonic shift in their approach to reliance on Russian energy. Now, fast development of renewables in the past couple of decades was a factor that had added them self-confidence in the approach that they are promoting right now. So yeah, there will always be folks that will use this perpetual excuse like nothing is possible, it will never be possible. I was involved in major reforms in the Russian government. Like I remember in 1998 with his own hands, I typed on my computer the draft government resolution obliging Gazprom to quarterly publish financial reports according to international financial standards. everybody told me, "You're crazy. This will never happen. Gazprom is so mighty, it will never allow this." Few years down the road, we made them do so. Now, every market analyst is used to actually make money diving into these reports, extracting data and processing it for his consumers, right? So, you know, when you are involved into a major transformation, and there's somebody telling you that it will never be possible, I mean, just make him go away and continue the good work. That's the recipe.
That's a fantastic answer. I think that, you know, it's pretty clear, right, that Europe can't continue to be so heavily reliant on Russian gas, especially not by the start of next winter. And it's also clear, I think, that Europe has a responsibility to deprive Russia of the economic resources that it's using to continue its aggression against its neighbour. So looking forward, what is the future for Russian energy exports, especially amid, you know, the proliferation of sanctions against Moscow? I think, Mary, if I start with you, please.
Vladimir may be better position to respond to that one, right? Yes, yeah. Well, I mean, just picking up on his last comment, I would say that it's absolutely true that this is you know, this is a question of commitment at such a critical time. If we haven't learned our lessons, if countries have not learned their lessons now, right, about the importance of what real energy security is, what diversification is, and recognizing when a country is or is not a reliable supplier, then it's going to be very, very unfortunate. And there's a little bit of analogy too to climate commitments, right? It's one thing to put things on paper, but then you've really got to attend to implementation. So I think continuing to manage very strong, you know, European global unity on this question is going to be really important. That being said, and then I will segue back over to Vladimir, is that yeah, Russia has significant resources, no question. And so he can describe better than I can what the trajectory might look like. But they've relied for many years on income from those natural resources, both fossil fuels as well as critical minerals, which we've touched on. And minerals and resources are where they are, right? And so there's some interest when it comes to things like critical minerals and ensuring that they continue to come to market. So you bear in mind the needs that are going to be required for our new energy future. But let me pass it back over to you on what the future might look like for fossil fuels in Russia.
Thank you. Well, in short, the era of hydrocarbon economy for Russia is over. It's just over. Some people still continue to say that we have to rely on Russian gas, but how it is possible if Russia, you see that it arbitrarily denies supplies to countries which does not fulfill its exotic requirements, to say the very least. Somebody doesn't want to pay in rubles and they switch off the gas completely. Now, how reliable a supplier is that? And there will be more in the coming months and years, believe me. So even if some people are reluctant to get rid of dependence on Russian oil and gas, they will be persuaded in a very short while. What will Russia do without oil and gas? Yes, we will be able to divert some of the volumes to Asian market, but this comes with huge price discounts and also much greater costs. So the super profits will be down to negligible, and that's important to understand. We will never receive the same amount of super profits and rents as we did from the European market, but there is also an opportunity. Because as the International Energy Agency points out, in the coming decades, we're heading towards $1 trillion market of goods and services for the green energy. Russia can enter that market. And it's important because there's also big interconnection with politics. Corrupt Putin's economy, oligarchic economy based on raw materials, will not be able to enter that market. Only normal future Russia, which will be investor-oriented, which will be at peace with the rest of the world, which will not attack anybody, will have an opportunity to enter that market. So this opportunity, I mean, it's all intertwined. It is only associated with Russia becoming normal country respecting rule-based international order. But the opportunity is there, and this is what we are telling the Russian society. Also importantly, green economy is far more job-intensive far more even in terms of distribution of added value across the chain, across territory, right? So it provides opportunity not only for a handful of oil-rich, gas-rich regions, but for anybody. So that's a much more evenly distributed economy. It's also a greater opportunity for building a society with greater equality and wealth distribution.
Yep. I think let's talk a little bit about the investment aspect, right? And I think there's a really good question that's come in that I'm going to read out. It doesn't say who it's from, but it says here, energy investment development is key for ensuring regional energy security. We've just been sort of mentioning that. How can the West counter China's efforts? And I think I would go further and, you know, how can all countries ensure that they're gaining security to influence the development of this infrastructure? How can the West engage the private sector, pension fund managers, and so on to fund projects? What needs to happen? You know, you've talked earlier, Kirsten, about the enabling infrastructure. What needs to happen to enable private capital to come in?
Well, I'm a political scientist, more working on governance issues, so I would leave rather this investment question. But I think it's talking about China. I mean, the big thing is really the Belt and Road Initiative and the issue of connectivity.
Yeah.
And I think this is something to learn from China, to strategically interconnect. That's what I tried to say with the interconnectors, with the electricity grids. This is extremely important for EU plus Europe to get interconnected in a way of, really exchanging green electrons and green molecules. So I think the big challenge is really to raise a lot of funding for right now the necessary infrastructure. And that I really think is key. And I look to others to have the recipes. I'm a bit concerned because we see now that, of course, the threefold crisis, as you said, we've seen the price crisis, we've seen the energy crisis, and now we are even in a supply crisis and suppliers crisis. Is that we're also seeing an end of cheap money, most probably, with inflation. And this is a kind of where I have concerns with regard to raising investments, because we were so accustomed to cheap capital. But maybe, this still can be raised, and I'm not the person to go deeper into that, but maybe Glenn.
Sure, yeah.
Yeah.
We raised the issue of raw material diplomacy or energy diplomacy. So I think, like it says in the proverb, when one door closes, then the other door opens, right? So I think Europe needs to be thinking about more multilateral, more bilateral relationships as well. Let's take the example of gas, right? As the dependency of Germany on gas from Russia declines, then there's an opportunity for a transatlantic partnership and then sourcing gas from the United States as a bridge technology as well. If you think of raw materials, there are countries, there are alternatives on the market, Australia or Canada, with an abundance of raw materials that we need, with, for example, an abundance of renewable energy, because we want to be doing this transition in a renewable fashion as well, not just harvesting, that think circular, think not just in terms of harvesting, but also establishing a circular economy, and ultimately areas that speak the same language, share the same values, right? I think that's the key, having new areas of partnership. And TTIP is kind of dead, but I mean, why not revamp that discussion in terms of having a strong economic relationship between Europe and the United States? Shared values, large economic zone, the largest economic zone in the world. We don't need tariffs in the automotive industry to protect our automotive industry in Europe from the US. In fact, we have our largest production plant in the US, so it's very global. Europe needs to be thinking in terms of new agreements, new free trade, new economic opportunities with the like-minded.
Absolutely. Is there appetite, do you think, from private investors, from pension funds and so on, to help accelerate the energy transition? What are you seeing, Mary?
Well, our understanding is that the capital is out there, and Kirsten may be absolutely right about the cost beginning to increase now, but the question is, in many cases, there being the right enabling environment. You touched on the governance issues. the biggest need and demand to really accelerate the energy transition is going to be in emerging and developing economies, and those are precisely the places in many instances where the rule of law issues or the other sort of governance and regulatory issues become, in some cases, bigger challenges. So I think it's one issue to identify the problem, the other how you overcome it. So, but it's not a question, I think, of the availability of capital. It's how you really attract it to the places that are most needed.
Exactly.
I may add shortly to this, because I think governments should send a clearer, firmer signals to the industry regarding the green transition. Because we see a lot of mixed signaling. Yes, the green transition, but we have this issue with war against Ukraine, so we got to tolerate the temporary revival of fossil fuels. There are very strong signals which have been discussing today that no, we will have to rely on Russian gas for ages. Or there are very capable and strong political voices inside the Western countries which say all this green transition is wrong. We gotta, get out of the Paris Agreement, and we need to still rely on fossil fuels. So when business hears these mixed signals, they start to try to catch a fish in this muddy water. So the signal should be a bit clearer. Green transition will happen. It's a great opportunity. You have to adapt. It's 3 major points.
Exactly. There's another question that's come in, and it is to you, Vladimir. It's from Anastasia Shapok. Tina, sorry, I've probably butchered your name, from Eastern Circles. And she says, will Chinese and Indian investors fill up the vacuum left by Western investors and partners? And will Russia become the resource appendix of China?
I don't see no rush from Chinese or Indian investors for filling the gaps. Because, listen, what happened is Russia became so much weaker.
Yeah.
Economy which is encircled by so many problems and is being more and more deglobalized by the day. Yep. So I don't see many advantages in investing. Like, first thing, you have to deal with brutal capital controls. Yep. They were introduced as a #1 response from the Russian central bank to this crisis, reinstating capital controls that were absent for 20 years. Now, how advantageous is that for investor? He has literally to beg to actually get out any single penny that is earned through his investments in Russia. So it was interesting, after Russia started the war against Ukraine, there were a lot of news that the government of India asked a number of their oil companies to provide proposals to actually replace some of the equity investors from the Western world that are exiting Russia now. To my best knowledge, correct me if I'm wrong, not a single positive response from the Indian industry on that yet.
That's very, very interesting. I think we've got enough time for a couple more questions from the audience. There's one here from Juraj Petrovic, who asks, and I think we have touched on this a little bit, but it's worth going back to. He asks, can this energy crisis reverse the not completely understandable stance of Germany against atomic energy? Don't know which way to go with that one. Who'd like to take that?
No, I think there's such a strong public opinion against nuclear energy in Germany. I think this won't change, because there's a strong belief up until now, and this is still continuing, a very strong support for a sustainable Energiewende.
Yeah.
And I don't see nuclear coming back into the picture in Germany.
Fantastic. I think that, what we've touched upon here is, very much about the energy transition and about, it really has taken a crisis to perhaps focus minds a little bit more. To what extent, then, do you think that Europe can finally make good on its climate goals? And how will Germany, in particular, and especially all of gas-dependent Europe, accelerate this switch? What do we need to do to make sure this isn't a missed opportunity? I'd like to give you all a chance to sort of give your thoughts on that. I think I'll start with you, Glenn.
Okay. Well, I think the Green Deal and the legislation and policies that the EU puts forward, they need to be even more comprehensive. And I'll just use the example of cars, right? And I alluded to this in the beginning. If you're going to be setting a 100% target in 2035 and turning off diesel, turning off gasoline, turning off plug-in hybrids, and focusing just on battery electric vehicles, then you need to have a comprehensive plan to get there. Where's the charging infrastructure?
Right.
Public and private. Do we have the access to raw materials? And I think a lot of the discussion in Europe, and I'm trying to be mild and diplomatic in terms of how I phrase it, is guided by a lot of, let's just try it, you know, let's just go for it. We need a strong target. It's sort of guided by principles, but it needs to be backed up by plans and commitments as well, and you need to take things step by steps, right? Other economic regions would never, let's say, cut off a technology where they have a leadership role and then just place a bet on the future and then hope that it'll turn out, right? You need to have comprehensive strategic plans to go in that direction. And the new technologies that we all talk about, they require framework conditions, the right framework conditions. Do you have the charging infrastructure? Do you have a hydrogen-based economy? Do you have the pipelines in place? Do you have the talents, the war for talents? We haven't talked about that either in terms of chips or the digital economy. Take a very, very comprehensive approach, and that would be kind of my concluding statement. Take a comprehensive approach, look at the framework conditions, and take it one step at a time. Let's focus on 2030 in terms of how far we can get there. And the ultimate goal that we have, and nobody's negotiating that, is climate neutrality by 2050. That's where we need to be going. And we have a lot of companies now that are committed to the Paris Climate Accord and the 1.5 degree trajectory. That includes BMW as well. That would actually be my closing statement.
Yeah, I think that's very important, the moving from talk to action. And with that, Mary, I'll hand over to you. What do you see?
Well, I absolutely agree with the point you just made, that it's all about action, implementation, no question. But I'll try to be the optimist here and say I do think that for many countries this has been quite a wake-up call.
Right.
Where they'll be 5 years from now, 10 years from now, can't necessarily predict, but that's why we think it's really very important to seize this moment. And in all fairness, I do think that the EU's Repower EU plan is an opportunity to really try to move the needle a little bit in a little bit more ambitious direction in terms of some of the targets. But it will rely on financing. We've talked about that quite a bit, and it will really rely on implementation. But this is the moment. I think it has to be seized, and it's just going to require real commitment and implementation.
Do you see these commitments happening? I mean, how confident are you?
Time will tell, right? So, I'd like to think that, you know, the next COP and the one thereafter will be opportunities for a little bit of accountability, but that has to be out there as well. So, but I think there's been some pretty seismic shifts in the global energy landscape, which was the point that I started off with. And I don't think this is all going to be reversed. And to really move ahead in a way that really undergirds our collective energy security interests and our longer-term climate goals as well, that this is the time to really double down on implementation.
Excellent. Vladimir, over to you.
I'm also optimistic. I believe Europe will make it, but I agree 100%. It takes a little bit more strategic planning, not just waiting with what the 27 member states or how many more will come up, but actually doing a strategic planning and also analyzing best practices.
Right.
There are a lot of nations which already achieved a lot of progress in green transition and are way ahead of everybody else, and they are in Europe. So when somebody says stuff like not possible, I think they always should be brought up to the better examples to say why this country was capable of achieving that, and you are saying not possible. So I think more strategic planning, more focus on best practices can really help achieve the goals faster. But again, at the end of the day, I'm optimistic.
Fantastic. And Kirsten, I'll give you the last word.
Oh, I mean, I echo what the others said. I also think key is action, and I'm also an optimist because I'm now working for H2 Global, an instrument that tries really to kick off the technologies and bring in hydrogen and the derivatives. And I think the good thing is that we have the Green Deal. So we had the answer basically already during the Corona pandemic, and it's also the answer now towards the geopolitical challenge. But still, I'm concerned. It's a huge challenge. Also talking about the tectonic shifts that we have to make in Germany. And I mean, we managed to go down to 35% now from Russia, but this is still a huge step. We see the bridge that we thought we are having is crumbling, and I agree it was wrong, but it was built on cheap Russian pipeline gas. So the bridge is narrow, it's crumbling, it's shorter, and it won't be easy. Yeah. And I really think we're seeing the effects of course, shifts of cheap Russian energy into Asia oil. And this will be a challenge. So we had the idea of the green paradox challenging the energy transformation. So and the IEA gave the answer, and Europe gave the answer. We need, in order to achieve decarbonization and climate neutrality, it needs, what was the term, unprecedented collaboration.
Yeah.
Most at best in the global world, but at least in EU plus neighborhood.
Absolutely. Well, I think that's all we've got time for. I'd like to thank all of our panelists for a brilliant, engaging conversation, and also to the audience members for some fantastic questions. Now, after a short coffee break, we will be live streaming a session from the Danube stage with the Prime Minister of the Slovak Republic, Eduard Heger, and the Federal Chancellor of the Republic of Austria, Karl Nehammer. So do stay tuned, and thank you very much.